Chapter 6.1 Vintage Variation. The elevator doors to the basement opened up, followed by a metallic jingle from the loudspeaker, as a strange scene spread out before me. There was some kind of reddish sepia film overlapping the entire area, which seemed to be that of a past version of the hospital. I placed the metal pipe beside me in the elevator and stepped outside. "Out of the way!" a male nurse yelled, as he and his colleague came rushing towards me. I stepped aside as they dashed into the elevator with a hurting patient sprawled out on a stretcher. A few other members of the hospital staff ran through the corridor with boxes of medicine and old-fashioned medical equipment. Groups of civilians were also present, some discussing patient matters with doctors, while others grieved or consoled each other. Another thing that caught my attention was that the basement was lit up by electricity as usual. Daylight reached into the corridor from portholes carved out above me into the solid concrete walls. From around a bend further ahead came a screaming man followed by two panicking doctors on the chase. I moved away just as they ran past me into the stairwell. The man was yelling something about how things like this weren't supposed to happen. If only the authorities had taken their responsibility seriously. What had befallen the town, and more importantly, where or when was I? I wasn't able to discern into which era I had come, but judging by the civilians' characteristic clothing, I assumed that I was at least 20 or 30 years into the past. Coming towards me with unfaltering steps from afar was a collection of doctors and nurses. Judging by their serious expressions and the binders in their hands, they seemed to have just come from some important meeting. Perhaps they were discussing the effect of what had transpired into Cordale. The result was a hospital largely thrown into disarray, and I was still confused by the entire change of scenery. Even though nothing in this town seemed to be what you'd first expect, I wasn't as surprised as I thought I'd be. I deftly zigzagged between the oncoming crowd of doctors and nurses, after which they all made their way into the stairwell. I continued onward while examining the signs above me. Wherever this vision had come from, I was certain that it wasn't real, and so I decided to follow the road towards the task I had come down here to perform. The nurse had told me to restart the main generator, so I checked the signs above to get my bearings straight. The first corridor to my right led to the boiler room. I swiftly passed by, but took a quick peek before carrying on. Inconsolable civilians were crying in the hallway, accompanied by nurses trying to calm their uneasy minds. Whatever had happened here must have taken quite a toll on the town. I continued, largely unfazed by the commotion around me, down what I deduced to be the basement's main corridor. I saw another stairwell as I came towards the end of the corridor. The sign pointed upward and read Floor 1. I quickly noted that the stairwells weren't blocked in this past version of the hospital. Ignoring the path in front of me, I took right into another corridor instead. The hallway ahead was largely devoid of people, and only a handful of weeping men and women passed me by. They were apparently on their way towards the path leading into a third stairwell connecting the basement to the first floor. As I carried on even deeper into the complex, I soon stumbled upon a T-crossing. 4 metal signs hanging by chains from the ceiling indicated that this was the way to the morgue, the laboratory, the basement storeroom, as well as my destination, the maintenance room. The feeling of being in the past was still highly tangible, but an air of uncertainty seemed to seep into whatever reality I was in. I grew more and more anxious as a sense of doubt slowly crept into my mind. I hesitated a moment at first, but then took a few steps into the adjacent corridor while carefully checking my surroundings. A lone woman was sitting on a bench on the opposite side of 2 white doors, with her hands pushed against her head. She was weeping uncontrollably, so I looked around for a member of the hospital staff to help her, but no one came. The formerly hectic basement was now completely derelict apart from the crying woman. Dim lights penetrated the glass in the door across the corridor, and the sign above stated that she had slumped herself down just outside the morgue. I threw a quick glance over my shoulder and saw that my destination was at the far end of the corridor behind me. Aiming to at least find out what was wrong, I walked up to the crying woman and asked, "Are you all right, ma'am?" She gave no answer. "Excuse me, is everything okay?" I insisted. Between her snivels, she dropped a note to the floor. I bent down to retrieve it and started reading through the poorly written lines on the tattered piece of paper. It read, "I'm sorry, honey. Things came up and I need to stay through next week as well. I know I promised to come home, and I know you want me to, especially after what happened to your parents. But you see, the men need a strong leader, and I am the only commanding officer capable of holding the training sessions after my superior retired last month. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Love you." The name of the writer had been left out, and the general attitude of the letter seemed distant and detached somehow. After reading through the letter, it somehow suddenly went into self-combustion and turned into a small fire in my hands. I immediately let go of the burning paper before it scorched my palms, and it ended up as a pile of dust on the floor. A strong force then suddenly grabbed hold of me, bringing me screaming and crying to the ground. Whatever it was, it seemed to grow fiercer the lower I stooped. As I lay backside down on the floor with tears in my eyes, hardly able to breathe, the grief-stricken woman stood up. Her hair and hands covered her countenance, so I was unable to distinguish any facial features. She then turned around to hide her constant weeping. I was still lying motionless on the floor, just barely breathing. "Bring him home," the woman spoke almost incoherently. "What?" I asked through my strained breathing. "We shall bring him home," she continued in a warped tone. After her ominous words, the daylight faded and the facade of the 80s crumbled, showing cracks in the very fabric of reality around me. I thankfully found myself able to breathe again and got up on my knees with a bit of effort. The woman before me fell into a heap on the floor, and an obscure figure arose from her meager body. The atmosphere suddenly turned cold when a thick darkness took over. The flowers wilted in their pots, and strange sounds replaced the former silence. The figure started to take form, and before I knew it, something took up place amongst the shadows, gazing angrily at me with menacing, pure white eyes. I was frozen with fear at first, but soon came to realize that fleeing was my only option. I turned tail and started running down the corridor towards the maintenance room at the furthermost end of the basement. I turned on the flashlight to light up my way, and as I passed by the basement storeroom to my left, I gleaned a horrible scene of some sort of demonic creatures closing in on a defenseless man. During my flight through the corridor, I could hear the monster roaring in the darkness, whereupon I threw a quick glance behind me with the aid of my flashlight. At the time, I didn't understand that my decision to check up on my pursuer was a truly awful move. When I once more turned to face the corridor ahead, a gathering of transparent creatures stood in my way. As I hopelessly collided with them, a strange sensation overcame me, followed by the weight of an unnatural headache. I forcibly made my way between the seemingly amenable creatures, but their obstructions slowed down my progress. In the corner of my eye, I saw that the monster from earlier was catching up to me. I pushed and pulled my way past the creatures, desperately trying to get into the maintenance room, which was only a few meters ahead. The monster wielded a club and started mowing through the now screaming translucent creatures, with its aim fixed on its main target, me. When I got up to the door leading into the maintenance room, I tugged the handle harshly and hurriedly went inside, closing and locking the door behind me. I then quickly barricaded myself inside with the help of a desk and a heavy bookcase. Just when I thought I was somewhat safe, the monster started banging at the door. Frightened by the whole situation, I immediately scoured the area for the fuse box of the main generator. Beside a large machine located in the darkest reaches of the maintenance room, inside a metal-grated confinement, was a box. I opened it up, and inside were 8 fuses. By using my flashlight, I figured out which fuses needed replacement, and hurriedly emptied a small unopened box of fuses into the palm of my hand. I then swiftly removed the faulty items and inserted the functional ones. between the screaming of the strange creatures and the banging monster outside. I hit the restart button on the generator in hopes that my efforts hadn't been in vain. The machine thankfully initiated a rebooting sequence and started back again after a few wheezing and snapping sounds. The lights flickered at first, but before long their radiance took over the darkness and lit up the surrounding maintenance room. Even though I had managed to return the main electricity to the facility, the monster wouldn't stop ramming the door. I quickly scoured the maintenance room and saw an emergency hatch in the roof. Without hesitation, I emptied a desk full of tools and positioned it just below the hatch. With the help of a crowbar I snatched from the hanger on the wall, I reached out for the handle and pulled open the hatch. Beyond the hole above was my path to freedom, I thought, and I quickly made my way through the hole into the area beyond. Enveloped by the soft radiance of the setting sun, I came up onto a patch of grass just outside the hospital. A spiral tunnel slide running from the roof down stood to my left, and shards from a smashed window above as well as a ladder was located to my right. I ignored the objects and instead decided to escape the premises in search of a way to leave the town before more disaster would befall me. I checked the compass on my wristwatch and made my way northward towards the mountainous North Star County. My final destination was the hostel in the Backlands Forest region around Cordale.